The lantern in the barn was burning low, and the woman on her knees did not know she was not alone. Her name was Sarah Whitfield, and she was 26 years old on the night this story begins, though grief had aged her hands past that number. The barn smelled of old hay and colder rain, and somewhere above her, in the deep shadow of the rafters, a man she had never seen was holding his breath so carefully that the dust between the beams did not stir. She did not hear him. She heard only her own voice, and even that came out smaller than she meant. "Lord," she whispered, "if you're still listening to women like me, please don't let them take my father's land." The words hung in the cold air the way smoke hangs after a candle is pinched out. She pressed her palms flat against the wooden floor and closed her eyes. "I don't know what to do," she said. "I don't know who to trust. And I am so tired of being brave in front of people who already decided I would fail." Up in the rafters, the man closed his eyes too, though for a different reason. He had crawled into the loft 3 hours before, when the sky was still bruised purple over the pines. He had meant to sleep and be gone before the rooster. He had not meant to hear anyone's prayer. Now the prayer sat on his chest like a hand, and he could not move without giving himself away, and he could not stay still without becoming, in some small, unwanted way, a witness. The lantern flickered. Sarah wiped her cheek with the back of her wrist and stood up. She lifted the lantern, and the light climbed the ladder and reached the underside of the loft, and it stopped just short of the boot the man had, out of long habit, kept tucked behind a hay bale. She did not look up. She said, "Amen," although her voice did not sound as though she believed the word. Then she blew out the flame, and the barn folded itself back into darkness. The man in the rafters listened to her walk across the yard. He listened to the porch door creak. He listened to the small, definite sound of a bolt sliding into place. Only then did he let his breath out, slow, the way you let air out of a wound so it doesn't hiss. He lay there a long time with his hat over his face. He had been called many things in the last 4 years. Drifter was one. Coward was another, in a saloon in Denton, and he had not argued. In the pocket of his coat he carried a folded piece of paper he had stopped unfolding. On it was a name that had once been his, and a sum of money offered for his return. The sum was smaller now than it had been 3 years ago, which was, he supposed, its own kind of mercy. Men forget. Paper's yellow. A face changes when it is not smiled at for long enough. He had come to Coldwater Bend because a mule skinner in Casper had said the town was quiet. Quiet was what he wanted. Quiet was what he had almost had, until a young woman with a lantern had walked into a barn and told God the truth in a voice that did not know it was being overheard. He was not a man who prayed. He was a man who had, once, been prayed for and had disappointed the prayer. He sat up. Below him, through a crack in the boards, he could see the yard and the small clapboard house and the thin line of smoke that meant she had gone inside and set a fire. He could see the barn door still ajar. He could see the road that led out of town, pale under a low half-moon. He could leave. He had left before. He had a horse hobbled in a stand of cottonwoods a quarter-mile east. He could be in the next county by breakfast. He sat with that thought for a while. He noticed that the thought did not warm him. He noticed that the woman had said, "I don't know who to trust." He noticed that he had once been the sort of man someone had said that about and had earned it and had lost it. Before dawn, he made a choice. It was not a large choice. It was the size of a man deciding to climb down a ladder instead of climbing out a window. But sometimes a life turns on a step of that size. He climbed down. He did not go to the house. He was not a fool. A stranger in a widow's kitchen before sunrise was a story that ended with rope, no matter what her prayer had said. Instead he went to the tack room and lit no lamp, and by touch he found her father's old harness and the ledger book that sat on a nail beside it, because on any working ranch there was a book on a nail beside the harness, and he had been a working man once. He carried the book out into the last of the moonlight and opened it against the barn wall. The pages were water-stained and honest. A man named Elias Whitfield had kept them. Cattle sold, feed bought, wages paid, a doctor's visit in a hand that shook near the end. The last entry was 6 weeks old and read, in careful block letters, paid in full to Bank of Coldwater Bend.
J'y marche, télé.
Kept receipt in Bible. The man read the entry 3 times. Then he closed the book, set it back on its nail, and walked out to the well and drew a bucket of water and washed his face with it. The water was cold enough to hurt. He wanted it to hurt. Hurt kept a man honest. By the time the eastern sky went the color of a peach skin, he had made a second, larger choice. He walked to the porch and, at a respectful distance, he sat down on the top step with his hat in his hands, so that when Sarah Whitfield opened her door at first light she would see, first, a stranger who was not hiding, and second, a stranger who was not armed in his hands, and third, a stranger who was waiting to be sent away. The door opened. Sarah saw him and did not scream, which surprised them both. She stopped in the doorway with a shawl pulled tight around her shoulders and a small pistol, held low, that he had not counted on and respected her for. He did not stand. "Ma'am," he said, "my name is not important yet. I slept in your loft last night without permission, and I heard something I was not meant to hear, and I did not leave, and I owe you an explanation for all 3 of those things." Sarah's hand tightened on the pistol, then loosened. She was looking at his boots, and the boots were pointed away from her, and the hat was in his hands, and the hands were open. "You heard me pray," she said. "I did. That was between me and the Almighty." "Yes, ma'am. And I aim to keep it that way. But your father wrote in his book that he paid the bank in full, and he wrote where he kept the receipt, and if what you were praying about is what I think it is, then the paper you need is inside your own house, and you don't have to lose this place at all." She stared at him. The porch railing was wet with dew. Somewhere a rooster finally, belatedly, remembered its purpose. Sarah Whitfield lowered the pistol until it pointed at the boards between them, which was not the same as putting it away, and she said, in a voice that had gone very quiet again, "What is your name, mister?" He looked at her a long moment. "Ask me tomorrow," he said. "If we still know each other tomorrow, I will tell you the truth. If we don't, then it wasn't a name worth carrying anyway." She thought about that. She thought about her father's Bible on the shelf beside the stove. She thought about the man from the bank who had come 3 times in a month, smiling with the top half of his face. She thought about how tired she was of being brave in front of people who had already decided she would fail. "Come inside," she said, "before the neighbors see." He stood up slowly so that she could see every part of the standing, and he followed her into the kitchen. He left the door open behind him. That was for her. She noticed. She did not close it. The kitchen was small and clean. A kettle hung over embers. A brown Bible sat on the shelf beside the stove, and it was thicker than a Bible ought to be, because a family that keeps papers safe keeps them where the Lord can look after them. Sarah lifted the Bible down. She set it on the table. She did not open it yet. She looked at the stranger instead. "If there is a receipt," she said, "and my father paid the bank in full, then why did a man named Silas Marsh come here on Tuesday and tell me my father owed the bank $640? And why did he bring a paper signed by a judge that said this house is to be sold at auction on the 1st of the month?" The stranger set his hat on the corner of the table, careful not to cover the Bible with it, because, he said, someone is lying. And if the receipt is inside that book, then we have until the 1st of the month to find out who. Sarah opened the Bible. The receipt was there. It was folded twice and tucked between the pages of the Book of Ruth, which had been her father's favorite because his own wife had come to him a stranger and stayed. The paper was thin. The ink was faded but readable. It said, in the same block letters as the ledger, "Received of Elias Whitfield, $640, in full satisfaction of all debts owed to the Bank of Coldwater Bend. This 3rd day of March, 1887. Signed J. Marsh Teller." Sarah touched the signature with one finger, the way a person touches a photograph of someone who has died. "He paid," she whispered. "He paid, and they still came for the land." The stranger looked at the paper for a long time. He did not touch it. He knew the value of a paper he had not touched. "Ma'am," he said, "this receipt is real. But that signature is not the same signature that is on the notice the bank sent you. I would like you to bring me the notice, if you will, and lay it beside this one, and let us look at them together." She brought the notice. They laid them side by side on the kitchen table, and the morning light came through the window slantwise, and the 2 signatures, side by side in the light, told a small and terrible truth. They were not written by the same hand. Sarah sat down. She did not cry. She had done her crying in the barn, and a woman does not cry twice about the same thing before breakfast. Then Mr. Marsh has cheated my father, she said. The stranger shook his head. Slowly. Not Mr. Marsh, he said. Someone using his name. Or Mr. Marsh doing what someone taught him to do. Either way, this is not a matter for one morning. This is a matter for a courthouse. And, ma'am, I have not been welcome in a courthouse for 4 years. He said it plainly, without asking for pity. Sarah looked up at him. Why not? She asked. Because I once loved a woman who died of a fever in a town where the doctor would not come without money. And I stole the money from a man who did not deserve to keep it, and I was seen. She died anyway. I have been running from that theft ever since, though not, I think, from the woman. He said it looking at the corner of the table, not at her. I did not tell you that so you would forgive me, he added. I told you so you would know what you are asking if you are going to ask. Sarah did not answer for a while. The kettle steadied itself over the embers. A magpie landed on the porch rail and looked in at them and flew away again. The world went on being a morning. I am going to ask, Sarah said. But first I am going to feed you. My father used to say a hungry man makes a poor witness. He almost smiled. It surprised his mouth. He nodded once and she poured coffee, and while the coffee cooled she went to the stove and stirred the fire, and neither of them spoke for a little while because they were both, in different ways, listening for hoofbeats on the road. They came before the coffee was cold. The stranger heard them first. He set his cup down without a sound, and Sarah saw his face change, the way a still pond changes when a fish moves underneath. How many? She asked. 1 horse. Coming from town. She looked at the door. She looked at the Bible. She looked at him. The root cellar, she said. Under the pantry rug. Take the ledger and the receipt and the notice. Do not take the coffee cup. He did not argue. He took the papers. He rolled the rug back with the toe of his boot, lifted the door, and dropped down into the dark. The door came back down. She flattened the rug. She picked up his coffee cup, poured it into hers, and set the empty cup back on the shelf. Then she sat down and folded her hands and waited. And by the time the knock came on her open door, she looked like a woman who had been sitting alone with her thoughts for an hour. Ms. Whitfield? She looked up. In the doorway stood a young man in a deputy's vest, hat in hand, sandy hair damp at the temples from a hard ride. His name was Tom Brenner, and he had gone to school with her younger brother, before her younger brother had gone west and not come back. Tom, she said, you're up early. Sheriff sent me, ma'am. He shifted his weight. He did not like his errand. She could see that in the set of his shoulders. There was a fella in the Elkhorn last night. Rough coat, dark hat, wouldn't give his name. Left before the sheriff could speak with him. Sheriff wants to know if any strangers came through your place. A stranger, Tom, on my place, in the middle of the night. She let a little tiredness into her voice. Only a little. You know I keep the barn locked. Yes, ma'am. I told him that. Was there trouble at the Elkhorn? No, ma'am. That's the thing. He drank 1 beer, paid in coin, and asked the barkeep where a man might find honest work. Barkeep said there wasn't any. Fella tipped his hat and walked out. That doesn't sound like a criminal, Tom. No, ma'am. He turned his hat in his hands. It doesn't. She let the silence sit. Tom Brenner looked at the coffee cup on the shelf, and at the second cup on the table, and at the Bible open to the Book of Ruth. He was not a stupid boy. He was only a boy who did not want to be a liar. He looked back at Sarah. I'll tell the sheriff nothing's here, he said. But Ms. Whitfield. He paused. He lowered his voice. The auction is 9 days off. And there are men in this town who are watching your place for reasons that are not the sheriff's. She met his eyes. Who is watching? I can't say, ma'am. Not without proof. But if you have a friend, this is a week to keep him close. He put his hat on. He nodded to her kindly, the way he had nodded to her when they were both children and he had knocked the wind out of her at a school picnic and did not know how to say sorry. Then he mounted and rode out, and the dust settled behind him, and Sarah sat very still until she could no longer hear the horse. She got up and rolled back the rug and opened the cellar door. You can come out, she said. But there is a great deal I need to tell you, and none of it will make you want to stay. He came up out of the dark, holding the papers dry against his chest. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and something small and unnamed passed between them, the way a match passes fire to a candle without the match becoming the candle. "Tell me," he said. She told him. She told him that her father, Elias Whitfield, had come to Coldwater Bend 22 years ago with a young wife and $40 and a mule, and had built the house they were standing in with his own hands and a promise from the bank. She told him that the bank in those years had been run by an old Scotsman named Angus Marsh, honest as flint, who had died 2 winters back and left the bank to his nephew Silas. She told him that Silas was polite in church and quick with a handshake and slower with an accounting, and that in the 2 years since old Angus had been in the ground, 3 widows in Coldwater Bend had lost their homes to debts nobody could remember them signing for. The stranger listened. He did not interrupt. When she was done, he said, "Only 3 widows. 3 that I know of. Mrs. Aylward on the North Road, Mrs. Peel above the creek, and old Mrs. Delacourt, who had no children and no one to ask questions for her. And now you, and now me." He set the papers down on the table with the care of a man setting down something that might break. "Ma'am," he said, "I came into this town last night meaning to be gone by dawn. I have a horse in the cottonwoods and a road that leads west and nothing waiting for me at the end of it except more road. I am telling you that because I want you to understand what I am about to say. Say it. I would like to stay until the 1st of the month. I would like to help you keep this place. I will sleep in the barn, not the house. I will take no wages. I will give you a name to call me while I am here, and it will not be my real name, and I will tell you my real name on the morning of the auction if we are both still standing. Do you accept that?" Sarah looked at him for a long time. "What shall I call you?" she asked. "Call me Reuben," he said. "It was my grandfather's name. He was a better man than his grandson. Reuben, then." She held out her hand. He took it. His hand was warm and rough and did not linger. "And I am Sarah, not Ms. Whitfield. Sarah." "Sarah," he repeated as though testing the shape of it. That was the first day. By the second day they had a plan, and it was a small plan because small plans are the only kind that survive contact with a courthouse. Reuben rode into Coldwater Bend on a borrowed mule, wearing Elias Whitfield's old Sunday coat, because a man in a Sunday coat is a man nobody looks at twice. He walked into the general store with a list Sarah had written out in her careful schoolteacher hand, and he bought flour and coffee and a tin of matches, and while the clerk was measuring the flour, Reuben leaned on the counter and said, casually, "I heard tell old Elias Whitfield used to trade here before he passed. Fine man, they say." The clerk was a thin fellow with a scar across the bridge of his nose. His name was Harlan Pike. He had worked at the store since he was 15. He looked up sharp. "Elias? Sure. Good customer. Paid cash. I heard he settled his account with the bank not long before he went. Big note, paid all at once. Must have been a relief to the family." Harlan Pike's face did not change, but his hands did. They stopped moving the scoop for half a second, and then they moved again a little too quickly. "I wouldn't know about the bank's business, mister." "No, of course not." Reuben smiled, the small smile of a man who was not asking. "I only mention it because he stopped in here that same afternoon, folks say, and bought a new hat. Said he wanted to be buried in it. Man doesn't buy a hat like that unless he's just come from paying off a debt." Harlan Pike wrapped the flower. He tied the string. He did not look up. "Elias didn't buy no hat here, mister. Not that week. Not any week that spring. He hadn't been in the store since February." Reuben paid. He tipped his hat. He walked out. He walked slow down the boardwalk, and he did not look back, and when he was around the corner he stopped and stood with his hand against the wall of the feed store and breathed once, deeply, because he had just been told a lie by a man who did not know he had been told the truth first. Elias Whitfield had indeed bought a hat that week. Sarah had shown it to Reuben that morning. It hung in her father's bedroom on a peg, still with the price tag pinned inside the band, in Harlan Pike's own handwriting. Someone had told Harlan Pike to forget. Reuben rode back to the ranch with the flour and the coffee and the beginning of a shape in his mind. The shape was ugly. It had more than one head. That evening, at the kitchen table, he told Sarah what he had learned. She listened. When he was done, she got up and went to the shelf and took down her father's day book. the one where Elias had recorded not money but weather and errands and the names of neighbors he had spoken with. She turned to the page for the 3rd of March, 1887. "Read it," she said. Reuben read. "Rode to town. Cold wind. Paid Angus at the bank. Bought hat at Pike's. Spoke with Reverend Coyle about spring planting. Home by supper." Reuben stopped. He read the entry again. "Paid Angus," he said. Sarah nodded, slowly, and the color went out of her face. "Angus Marsh," she said. "Old Angus. The uncle. Who has been dead these 2 years. Then who signed the receipt?" "Silas," says J. Marsh teller. But old Angus had been president then, not teller. The teller in 87 was Silas, still learning the trade. "So Silas took my father's money. Silas wrote the receipt. Silas knew the debt was paid." She sat down. "And 2 years later, when his uncle died, Silas kept the paper that said my father had paid, and he wrote a new one that said my father had not." Reuben did not answer for a while. Then he said very quietly, "Sarah, there is a thing I need to ask you, and it is not a kind question." "Ask it." "Who signed for the loan your father supposedly still owed?" "Because someone signed. A bank does not foreclose on a debt without a signature on file." Sarah looked at him. "The notice said my father signed it. In 88. But my father did not borrow again after he paid off Angus. He wrote it in the book. He wrote it on the flyleaf of the Bible. He wrote it in a letter to my aunt in St. Louis, and my aunt kept the letter, and I have seen it. Then someone forged your father's name." "Yes." "Whose handwriting could match his well enough to fool a judge." She was silent for a long moment. "The Reverend," she said. "Reverend Coyle. My father's friend. He copied my father's letters for him in the last year, when my father's hand shook too badly to write. Reverend Coyle knew my father's signature better than my father did." She said it like a person saying the name of a disease that runs in her family. Reuben looked at the lamp. "Reverend Coyle," he said. "He baptized me. He preached at my mother's funeral. He came to sit with my father the night before he died and read him the book of Ruth aloud." Her voice was very steady and very small. "He is Silas Marsh's brother." Reuben set his hands flat on the table. "Then we are not fighting a banker," he said. "We are fighting a family." Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods. The lamp guttered and steadied. Somewhere down the road, a dog barked once and stopped. "Reuben," Sarah said. "Yes." "On the morning of the auction, when you tell me your real name, will it be a name I can trust?" He looked at her a long time. "I hope so," he said. "For the first time in 4 years, I hope so." 3 days later, on a gray afternoon that smelled of coming rain, Reuben rode out alone to the North Road, past the burned stump where Mrs. Aylward's house had stood before the bank had taken it, and let it stand empty until a spark from a passing wagon had done the rest. He rode past the creek where Mrs. Peel had drowned her sorrow, some said, and her body, others said, though the sheriff had ruled it an accident. He rode until the road narrowed to a track, and the track narrowed to a path, and the path stopped at a line shack tucked into the shoulder of Mercy Creek Canyon. Smoke rose from the tin chimney. Reuben dismounted 100 yards out and walked the rest, hands empty, whistling a hymn tune off key on purpose, because a man who is whistling badly is a man who is not sneaking. The door of the shack opened before he reached it. A rifle came out first, then the man behind it. He was older than Reuben, maybe 50, with a bookkeeper's stoop and a bookkeeper's spectacles and hands that were used to ink, not iron. The rifle was steady, but the eyes were not. "That's far enough," the man said. Reuben stopped. He raised his hands, palms out. "Mr. Marsh?" he said. The rifle jerked. "There is no Marsh here." "There is, sir. There is A.J. Marsh, who signed a receipt on the 3rd of March, 1887, for a farmer named Elias Whitfield. And that J. Marsh is not the man who is presently running the bank in Coldwater Bend, because the man who is presently running the bank in Coldwater Bend cannot sign his own name the same way twice, and the man who signed that receipt could. So I am guessing, sir, that you are the elder Marsh, not old Angus, his nephew, Jeremiah, Silas's older brother, who was said to have died of pneumonia in the winter of 88, but whose grave, when I visited the churchyard yesterday, had no lichen on it, because it was cut fresh last month." The rifle wavered. Who sent you? A young woman who prayed in a barn, Reuben said, and who does not yet know I have come here. If you shoot me, sir, she will still lose her father's land, and you will still be dead to a town that used to love you, and no one will be better for it. If you let me speak, there is a small chance we can both wake up next month as men. Jeremiah Marsh lowered the rifle. Not all the way. Enough. Come inside, he said. The wind is going to bring rain. Inside the shack there was a cot, a stove, a stack of ledger books tied with string, and a photograph of a young woman in a plain frame beside the lamp. Jeremiah sat on the cot. Reuben stood. They told the town you were dead, Reuben said. They told the town what my brother needed the town to believe. Jeremiah's voice was tired in a way that voices get when they have been tired for years. Silas came to me in the summer of '88. He said Uncle Angus was sick and would not last the winter. He said the bank was in more trouble than the town knew. He said there were 3 loans that could be quietly recalled, and no one would know because the borrowers were old or alone or dead. He asked me to write the papers. And you did. I did. God help me, I did. I told myself we would put the money back once the bank was steady. I told myself the borrowers would not miss what they did not know they had. Mrs. Delacourt died before the papers were served on her. Mrs. Aylward could not read them. Mrs. Peel could, and she walked into the creek. He said this without expression, the way a man says a thing he has said to himself so many times it has worn smooth. That was when I told Silas I was done. I told him I would go to the sheriff. He told me the sheriff would hang me before he touched him. He was not wrong. So he killed you on paper. He killed me on paper. He wrote my death in the county book. He put a stranger's bones in a coffin. He sent word to our cousin in Missouri that I had died of pneumonia. And he sent me here with a rifle and a stack of ledgers, and he told me that as long as I stayed hidden, the widows I had wronged would live, and I would live and my daughter in St. Joseph would go on believing her father was in heaven, which was a cleaner story than the truth. And now Elias Whitfield's daughter is next. Jeremiah closed his eyes. Yes. Why? Because Silas has borrowed against the bank's assets to buy railroad shares, and the railroad has not come, and the shares are worth nothing, and the auditors from Cheyenne are coming in the spring. He needs the Whitfield land to sell to a cattle buyer from Ogallala for cash. If he can put cash in the vault by April, the auditors will find a healthy bank. If he cannot, they will find a swindler, and he will hang, and the whole clean face of Coldwater Bend will crack open. Reuben was quiet for a while. Mr. Marsh, he said, you have a stack of ledgers there. Are they the real ones? They are the ones my brother made me keep. Every forged loan, every false signature, every widow's name. Would you let a court see them? Jeremiah looked at the photograph on the table. His hand went out and touched the frame and came back. My daughter believes I am in heaven, Mr. What is your name? Reuben. Reuben. My daughter believes I am in heaven. If I walk into a court, she will learn her father is a forger and a coward. She will learn it in a newspaper, and she will read it aloud to her own children someday, and my name will be awound in that house forever. And if you do not walk into court, Sarah Whitfield will lose her home, and the next widow after her will lose hers, and your brother will kill another woman on paper, and your daughter will still someday find out. Sir, forgive me, but the choice is not whether your daughter learns. The choice is whether she learns you were the coward who ran or the man who came back. Jeremiah Marsh sat on the cot in the line shack at the head of Mercy Creek Canyon and looked at the photograph of a young woman in a plain frame, and outside the wind brought the rain the way he had said it would, and it came down on the tin roof with a sound like small change falling. Tell me your plan, he said. Reuben told him. It was, as plans go, a small one. It required a wagon, a witness, a lawyer in the county seat of Fort Ashwell who had once been honest, a copy of the receipt, the ledgers from the shack, Jeremiah Marsh alive on the courthouse steps at 8 o'clock in the morning on the 1st of April, and Sarah Whitfield beside him with her voice steady enough to say her father's name without breaking. It required Reuben to ride into Coldwater Bend openly, in daylight, and let himself be seen, so that Silas Marsh would come after him and not after the wagon that would leave the ranch by the back road at 4 in the morning. It required Deputy Tom Brenner to be looking the other way at a moment of Tom Brenner's choosing. It required, above all, that Reuben stop running. They rode back to the ranch in the rain, Jeremiah behind Reuben on the horse, hat pulled low, and by the time they arrived Sarah had a fire going and stew on and had, without asking, made up the little back room that had been her brother's, because a woman who has fed a stranger once knows the shape of feeding too. She stopped in the doorway when she saw Jeremiah. "Mr. Marsh," she said. Her voice did not tremble, but her hand did, once, on the doorframe. "You were at my father's funeral. You wept." "I did, ma'am, because you knew what your brother would do next." Jeremiah did not answer for a long moment. "Yes." Sarah walked into her own kitchen and set 2 more places at the table, and she did not weep, and she did not shout, and she did not forgive him, because forgiveness was a matter for later, when it could be given honestly. She only said, "Sit down. The stew will cool." They ate. They spoke little. When the plates were cleared, Sarah lit a fresh lamp and set it in the middle of the table and said, "Tell me everything I do not yet know." Jeremiah told her. He told her the names of the widows and the amounts and the dates. He told her about the auditors. He told her about the cattle buyer from Ogallala. He told her about the letter Silas had made him write to his own daughter, in his own hand, saying he was dying of pneumonia and did not wish her to see him wasted, and she should remember him strong. He told her that the daughter had written back a letter he had never been allowed to read. Sarah listened without interrupting. When Jeremiah was done, she said only, "Where is the daughter's letter now?" "Silas has it." "Then we will get it back too." That was the night the plan became a promise. The next 4 days were the hardest of Sarah Whitfield's life, and she had already had some hard ones. She went into town on Sunday morning and sat in the front pew of the little white church on Coldwater Bend's only rise, and she listened to Reverend Coyle preach on the Book of Ruth, and she did not let her face move once. Reverend Coyle had a kind, round face and a voice like warm milk, and he preached that a good woman is a woman who trusts, and Sarah sat in the pew and thought, "I trusted you when I was 6 years old, and you put your hand on my head at my mother's grave, and you have been stealing from women like me for 2 years, and I will look you in the eye on the courthouse steps next Friday, and you will not know until it is too late." After the service, Reverend Coyle came down the aisle and took her hand. "Sarah, my dear, how are you holding up? I've been praying for your situation." "Thank you, Reverend. It grieves me. It grieves me deeply. If there is anything the church can do, there is one thing, Reverend." She let a little of her tiredness show. "It was not hard. Would you come out to the house on Thursday evening? Just to sit with me. Read a chapter. My father found comfort in your reading at the end." He beamed. Truly beamed. It was the smile of a man whose long con was about to be crowned. "Of course, Sarah. Of course. Thursday evening. I will bring my own Bible." She thanked him. She walked home. She did not look back. Behind her, in the churchyard, Reverend Coyle stood a moment longer than he should have, watching her go, and the smile stayed on his face a beat too long, and Deputy Tom Brenner, who was leaning against the fence in his Sunday clothes, saw it and stored it up and said nothing. Thursday came. At 3 in the afternoon, Reuben rode into Coldwater Bend on Elias Whitfield's tall gray mare, without a coat, hat pushed back, whistling. He rode down the main street once. He tied the mare at the rail in front of the Elkhorn. He walked inside. He drank 1 beer. He paid with a coin from his own pocket, not Sarah's. He walked back out. He mounted. He rode down the street a second time, slower. By the time he reached the far end of town, Silas Marsh was standing in the door of the bank in his shirt sleeves, watching him. Reuben tipped his hat. Silas did not tip his. Reuben rode out the west road at a walk, and 1/2 mile out of town he heard, as he had expected, a second horse leave the bank hitching post at a canter. He did not turn around. He rode on. The road wound up into the low hills. The sun sank toward the ridges. Behind him, the second horse kept pace, but no closer, because Silas Marsh was a careful man, and a careful man does not close on a stranger in open country when he does not yet know why the stranger has come. At 6 o'clock at the ranch, Reverend Coyle drove up in his black buggy with his Bible on the seat beside him. Sarah met him at the porch. She smiled the small smile of a tired woman who was grateful for company. She led him inside. She poured him coffee. She sat him at the kitchen table where 2 months before her father had sat with him and let him copy a signature. She said, Reverend, before we read, I want to ask you something. Of course, my dear. Do you remember the last letter my father wrote to my aunt in St. Louis? The one you helped him with because his hand shook? Reverend Coyle nodded gently. I do. He wrote in that letter that he had paid the bank in full and had no debts left in this world. Do you remember writing those words for him? The Reverend's mouth moved, very slightly. He picked up his coffee cup. He set it down without drinking. Sarah, my dear, your father was old. His memory was not always. He wrote it in his daybook too, Reverend. In his own hand. On the same day. And on the flyleaf of his Bible. And in a note to Angus Marsh, which the bank has not returned to me, but which I have asked a lawyer in Fort Ashwell to subpoena. Reverend, did my father owe the bank any money on the day he died? Reverend Coyle looked at her. Behind him, from the back room, Jeremiah Marsh stepped quietly into the doorway. He did not speak. He did not need to. He only stood there in the light from the kitchen lamp, in his brother's dead man's coat, and let the Reverend see him. Reverend Coyle's cup fell out of his hand. It did not break. It rolled across the table and clinked against the salt cellar and stopped. Jeremiah, the Reverend whispered. Hello, Ezra, said Jeremiah Marsh quietly. It has been a long time. Reverend Coyle sat very still. His round, kind face went a color that faces should not go. His hand went to the collar of his shirt, as though it were choking him. Reverend, said Sarah. In the morning, at 8 o'clock, on the steps of the courthouse in Fort Ashwell, Jeremiah is going to present the true ledgers of the Bank of Coldwater Bend to Judge Halvorson. My father's receipt will be entered into evidence. So will Mrs. Delacourt's and Mrs. Aylward's and Mrs. Peel's. So will the letter your brother made Jeremiah write to his own daughter. I would like you to be there, not as a witness for us, as a witness for yourself. Because when the true ledgers are read aloud, your name will be in them, and there is only one way for you to keep any part of the life you have built in this town, and that way is to walk into the courthouse of your own accord, before Silas walks in, and ask the judge for mercy while there is still mercy to be asked for. She spoke it evenly. She had practiced. Reverend Coyle looked at his hands. Silas will kill me, he said. Silas is riding west after a man who is not there, said Jeremiah. He will not be back until tomorrow noon. By tomorrow noon, if you and I are on those courthouse steps at 8, Silas will be arrested at the town limit before he ever knows what has happened. If we are not there, he will destroy the ledgers, kill me quietly in this shack he thinks I still inhabit, and marry Sarah's neighbor's daughter next spring, and go on being loved by this town for another 20 years. That is the choice, Ezra. It is a small choice. It is the size of a man deciding to ride in a wagon he did not want to ride in. But sometimes a life turns on a choice that size. The Reverend sat at the kitchen table in the little house that Elias Whitfield had built with his own hands, and outside the wind moved through the cottonwoods, and the lamp guttered and steadied, and somewhere a dog barked once and stopped. He wept. It was not pretty. It was not the weeping of a man who had been caught. It was the weeping of a man who had been waiting, for 2 years, to be caught, and had almost given up hope. I will come, he said. They left the ranch at 4 in the morning. Sarah drove the wagon because a woman driving a wagon before dawn draws less notice than a man does. Jeremiah lay under a canvas in the bed, with the tied ledgers beside him. Reverend Coyle rode his own buggy behind, because a reverend abroad before dawn was a reverend on his way to a deathbed, and no one in Coldwater Bend would stop him. Reuben stayed behind at the ranch because Reuben was the bait, and bait does not run. He sat on the porch with his hat on his knee and watched the eastern sky, and by the time the sky went the color of a peach skin he heard hoofbeats on the road, and it was not Sarah returning, and it was not the deputy, and it was not any friend of his. Silas Marsh rode into the yard alone, on a lathered horse, with a rifle across his saddle bow. Reuben stood up slowly so that Silas could see every part of the standing, and he set his hat on the porch rail, and he walked down the steps empty-handed and stopped in the middle of the yard. Mr. Marsh, he said. Silas did not dismount. He looked down at Reuben from the horse. He was younger than his brother and handsomer, and his eyes were very pale. Where is she? He said. Not here. Where? On the road to Fort Ashwell, Mr. Marsh. With your brother in her wagon. And with the true ledgers of your bank. and with a receipt in your own hand, written when you were still a teller, that says her father did not owe you a nickel on the day he died. Silas Marsh went white around the mouth. You're bluffing. I am not, sir. And if you shoot me now, you will still not catch her. The wagon left 4 hours ago. You cannot ride to Fort Ashwell in 3 hours on a horse that is already lathered. You can, however, ride to the town limit and turn yourself in to Deputy Brenner, who is presently standing at that limit with a warrant that was signed at midnight by Judge Halvorson on the strength of a telegram from your brother. Or you can shoot me and ride west, and be a man with a price on his head instead of a man with a lawyer. The rifle in Silas Marsh's hands did not move. His eyes did. They flickered once toward the west road and then back to Reuben, and Reuben saw in that flicker the exact moment when a careful man calculates the price of a bullet and finds it too high. Who are you? Silas said. Reuben looked up at him. My name is Reuben Ainsley, he said. There is a warrant for me too in the state of Kansas, for years old, for a theft I committed in a town called Prosper. I stole $72 from a man named Halloran to pay a doctor who came too late. I have not spent a night without regretting it. I am going to ride into Fort Ashwell behind your brother's wagon, sir, and I am going to stand at the back of the courtroom, and after Judge Halvorson is done with you I am going to walk up to him and give him my own name and my own warrant, because I would like, for the first time in 4 years, to sleep in a bed that is mine. Silas Marsh stared at him. Then, slowly, with the tired care of a man whose long con had come finally to its natural end, he laid the rifle across the saddle horn, and he turned his horse, and he rode down the road toward town at a walk, because a walk was the pace of a man who had already been arrested and simply had not yet reached the deputy. Reuben watched him go. He did not move for a long time. He watched until the horse was a small dark shape at the end of the road, and then he watched until it was nothing at all, and then he watched the empty road, because sometimes what a man is watching is not a road but the space inside himself where fear used to live. Then he went into the barn, and he saddled Elias Whitfield's tall gray mare, and he rode east toward Fort Ashwell in the clean, cold morning, and he arrived at the courthouse at 9:30, and the doors were closed because court was in session. He sat on the steps and waited. At 11 the doors opened. Sarah Whitfield came out first, and she was not crying, and she was not smiling, and her face was the face of a woman who had said her father's name in a public place and had not broken. She saw Reuben on the steps. She stopped. She walked down to him. She did not speak for a moment. Then she said, quietly, Silas is in a cell in Fort Ashwell. Reverend Coyle confessed in open court and is bound over for trial. Jeremiah gave his testimony and has been granted the court's clemency in exchange for full restitution. Judge Halvorson has stayed the auction and voided the false deed. The land is mine, Reuben. The land is mine. Reuben nodded, slowly, once. Good, he said. There is one more thing. Yes. Judge Halvorson would like to see you inside. Reuben stood. He set his hat on his head. He walked up the courthouse steps with Sarah beside him, and at the top of the steps he paused and he looked at her and he said, Sarah. Yes. Reuben. My name is Reuben Ainsley. She did not look surprised. She only nodded the way a person nods when a thing they have already known is finally said aloud. I knew, she said. I found a handbill in your saddlebag the second day. I did not show you. I wanted you to tell me yourself. You have known for 3 weeks. I have known for 3 weeks that you were a man who stole $72 for a woman who was dying, and I have known for 3 weeks that a man who does that is not the sort of man who cannot be trusted. He is the sort of man who has not yet forgiven himself. There is a difference. He looked at her a long moment. Sarah, he said. Come inside, she said. The judge is waiting. Judge Halvorson was a small, dry man with white side whiskers and eyes the color of river stones. He was seated behind a long oak desk in the chambers behind the courtroom, and on the desk in front of him was a piece of yellow paper that Reuben recognized without needing to be told. It was the handbill from Kansas. The judge looked up as Reuben came in. Mr. Ainsley, Your Honor, Ms. Whitfield tells me you rode to Fort Ashwell of your own free will, unarmed, to present yourself to this court, in the knowledge that this paper exists. Yes, Your Honor. She also tells me that without your intervention, for widows in the county of Coldwater Bend would have lost their homes, and one banker and one minister would have gone on prospering, and my own court would have signed at least one more fraudulent deed inside of a month. Is that so? I would not put it that way, Your Honor. Ms. Whitfield saved her own land. I only listened. Judge Halvorson looked at him for a long moment. Mr. Ainsley, I have sent men to prison for less than $72. I have also, in my time, seen a man wear a warrant like a stone around his neck for so long that the stone became heavier than the crime. The state of Kansas has, as of last spring, a statute of limitations on nonviolent theft under $100 of 5 years. Your warrant is 4 years and 8 months old. In 4 months, Kansas will forget your name entirely. Until then, I have no jurisdiction to hold you, and no inclination to send a telegram. Reuben stood very still. Your Honor, he said. Mr. Ainsley, go home. Whichever home that turns out to be. And do not appear in my courtroom again unless it is to testify on behalf of a woman who is telling the truth. Is that clear? Yes, Your Honor. Good day, sir. Reuben walked out of the chambers. Sarah was waiting for him in the hall. She looked up as he came out. He did not need to speak. She saw it in his face. She reached out once and touched the back of his hand with 2 fingers, and then she withdrew, because a courthouse hall is not a place for the things that were beginning to be true between them. They rode home together in the wagon. Jeremiah Marsh rode home in a different wagon, under a different name, to a small farm in the next county that a court-appointed guardian had leased for him with the first of the restitution funds. He would write to his daughter that night, in his own hand, a letter that would take 4 pages, and it would tell her, plainly, that her father was not in heaven, and that her father was not the man she had thought, and that her father was, however, still her father if she wished to write back. She would write back. That is not part of this story, but it is worth knowing. Reverend Coyle would spend 9 years in the territorial prison at Laramie, and would die there in the 8th year of a chest ailment, and would be remembered in Coldwater Bend not as a thief but as a warning, which is a harder legacy but a truer one. Silas Marsh would go to prison too, for longer, and would not be remembered kindly. Deputy Tom Brenner would be elected sheriff of Coldwater Bend the following autumn, on a platform of 1 sentence, which was, I will look widows in the eye. He would win by a wide margin. The 3 widows whose homes had been taken would receive, over the next 2 years, the full value of their lost land, in cash, from the sale of the bank's remaining assets, and Mrs. Aylward would use hers to build a small schoolhouse on the North Road, which is still standing. The Bank of Coldwater Bend would reopen under new management within the year, run by a woman from Cheyenne named Miss Ida Hollis, who kept 2 ledgers on her desk at all times, one in ink and one in pencil, and who would answer any question any customer asked her, in full sentences until the customer was satisfied. And on the ranch at the edge of Coldwater Bend, in the small clapboard house that Elias Whitfield had built with his own hands, a young widow named Sarah and a drifter named Reuben Ainsley would spend the rest of that spring rebuilding a fence line, and then a corral, and then, slowly, a life. He slept in the barn for the first 2 months. That was his own choice and hers, and they did not discuss it, because some things are decided by the way a man hangs his hat. In the 3rd month, on a warm evening in June, she came out to the barn with a lantern in her hand and stood at the foot of the ladder, and she looked up and she said, Reuben, come down. You are not a stranger anymore, and I am tired of feeding you at the porch. He came down. They were married in the little white church on Coldwater Bend's only rise, in the autumn of that year, by a young minister sent up from Fort Ashwell to fill the pulpit Reverend Coyle had left empty. There were 42 people in the church, and 38 of them were widows and their children and grandchildren, and the 4 who were not were Deputy Sheriff Tom Brenner, Miss Ida Hollis, Jeremiah Marsh, and Jeremiah Marsh's daughter, who had come out from St. Joseph on the train. The next spring, on a morning very like the morning this story began, Sarah Ainsley walked into the barn before dawn. She was not alone this time. She carried a small lantern, and inside the lantern the flame was steady, because there was no wind, and she carried, tucked under her other arm, her father's Bible, which was thicker than a Bible ought to be, because a family that keeps papers safe keeps them where the Lord can look after them. She knelt in the same place she had knelt 1 year before. She said softly, Papa, it is done. The land is safe. Your name is clean. And the man in the rafters that night has a name I can call in the morning. Behind her, in the doorway of the barn, Reuben Ainsley stood with his hat in his hands, and he did not speak, because he did not need to, because he had, at last, learned the shape of listening. She opened the Bible. Between the pages of the Book of Ruth, folded twice, was a small piece of paper. It was not the old receipt. That paper had gone into the court's evidence and had not come home. This paper was newer, and it was written in her own careful schoolteacher hand, and it said only, "Heard in a barn, on the night of March the 29th, 1887. Lord, if you are still listening to women like me, please do not let them take my father's land." Answered. She pressed the paper flat between the pages, and she closed the Bible, and she stood up, and she turned, and she walked out of the barn with Reuben, and the sun came up over the ridge behind them, and the lantern in her hand was still burning, because sometimes a small flame kept lit through the dark is the whole quiet miracle of a life. If the story stayed with you, share in the comments the moment you felt most deeply, the one that reached down and touched something honest inside you. And if you love original frontier tales of courage, listening, and second chances that had to be earned before they could be given, you're warmly welcome to ride with us into the next one. There is another lantern already burning, and another door already open, and we would be grateful to have you beside us when the story begins.